Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we are finally going to be talking about the newest album from the Wonder Years called Sister Cities. So here's something as a music critic that I'm very conscious of, but I doubt that anybody else has really noticed. The Token album. And even if you're not a critic, you've probably seen evidence of it in the I don't like this genre, but I like this album. Now, on the one hand, the records that typically fall into this narrow category can hit some universal appeal that even those who might not be fond of the genre for some reason can't deny the greatness. But when you have musical subgenres that don't tend to get a lot of critical respect, there's this air of condescension that comes with some of these picks for year-end lists that can be pretty damn obnoxious. Now, I've already mentioned this can happen with artists like, say, Casey Musgraves of her new album Golden Hour, but she was making an obvious play for crossover appeal. What we're going to be talking about more today are the artists who are really damn great within their own genre with that style, and yet get picked up as critical darlings as the Token band by folks and critics who will never deign to explore deeper, and that does a disservice to the entire genre, especially if there's more quality there that just hasn't gotten out yet. And yet with a band like the Wonder Years, you'd think critics would have learned by now. Coming from the fertile intersection of pop punk and the 2010s emo revival, their early work might have been slagged as formulaic, but by 2011 they had hit a serious stride with Suburbia, I've Given You All, and Now I'm Nothing, tapping into the decay of American suburbia and existential teenage angst on a much more broad, much more universal, much more detailed scale. This is a group that fused the layered personal detail of emo with the huge hooks of pop punk, and was a synthesis that won over fans of both genres very quickly, especially on their follow-up records The Greatest Generation and No Closer to Heaven, albums that are really damn great in retrospect, even if I personally prefer Suburbia. But those records started to get picked up by some critics as their token pop punk or emo act on their year-end list, and as such, you can tell that's kind of galling coming in from the outside, but it did mean there was a lot more attention for their new album Sister Cities, which might have come at a bit of a rough time, as many of the longtime fans were saying this record didn't quite hold up to the standards of the earlier releases. But hey, I still wanted to cover it, given that I've been criminally late to this party with this group before. This is the first The Wonder Years record that I've covered on this channel, so alright, how is Sister Cities? Well, I certainly get why so many fans have considered this a step back from their last few albums, but I'd also argue that's very much the wrong way to consider Sister Cities, because make no mistake, this is a really damn good, frequently great record, but it's also very much a transitional one in its genre, production, and songwriting, pivoting slightly away from the emo and punk scope to something that's bigger and heavier, with the sort of pitch black and impressively mature perspective you'd say from like Def Havana's last album than anything from like Sorority Noise. Now that's a very bold step, and one that will always certainly challenge and potentially alienate the diehard fans, but honestly, I think they pulled it off, even if I might personally prefer All These Countless Nights a little bit more if we're going into that lane. And this means we're gonna have to start the conversation with the sound, the composition, and the production, because at least in comparison to their past three albums, this album is decidedly not as bright, not as immediately anthemic. The hooks, they are more restrained, they play with more minor key progressions. The guitar lines, they don't quite have the same color, and they're allowed to get either a little bit more liquid, a little bit more melodic and distant, or just fuzzed out and jagged and noisy. The contrast between Dan Campbell's quieter, clean singing and desperate screaming has never felt more pronounced, even when they tilted more towards emo on their previous albums. It is by far the least pop punk the band has ever been, with some even drawing some parallels to, say, post-hardcore, which I would be hesitant to apply, because the one thing the Wonder Years kept from pop punk was pretty straightforward compositions and a commitment to some solid hooks. They do go off on some weird directions, but not really in the post-hardcore vein. What stands out significantly more are the diversions into tones and tempos that resemble more alternative rock. Faint, fizzy drum machines that open up what look like lightning, and the choppy strumming that provides some vestige of an uneven foundation. A more subdued, atmospheric vibe overall, even hints of tremolo picking on the solo of the Orange Grove, and it is bleak. Not so much the immediate shot of self-flagellating sadness that you see across a lot of emo with moments of howling release and catharsis, but a lot more dour and slower and teetering on the edge of burnout that only comes from an act that is seen and done entirely too much too quickly, with a sort of bone-deep weariness that makes the soaring hooks and scattered major chord melodies shine out all the further, and even then that can be kind of tainted, even if the subtext is still pretty melancholic, like on songs like It Must Get Lonely. And again, not for the first time, I can easily sketch the comparison to All These Countless Nights by Def Havana, one of my favorite records of last year. But there are definitely more sparks of noisy vibrancy that careen off of Sister Cities, even if I wouldn't quite say the hooks are quite at the same level as their best. And look, that's something you can only really say about this album coming off those 3 supremely catchy early albums, because tunes like Pyramid Assault, the thrumming, bass-driven hook of the title track that I really liked, or even the Orange Grove, they are catchy as hell. And even then, the Wonder Years, they are working that loud, soft dynamic about as hard as any vintage grunge or emo act, which can be a little bit tricky, especially given that Campbell's vocals are not really layered consistently in a way to ride those heavier riffs effectively. And on songs like Heaven's Gate, Sad and Sober, The Ghost of Right Now, or even the second half of We Look Like Lightning, he can definitely sound like he's getting a bit drowned out in the mix, which is a shame because his vocal delivery on those last 2 songs has a ton of intensity. It's kind of genuinely fascinating because it seems like so much of the vocal production on this album was prepared for the more atmospheric and spacious cuts like the closer, so when you get songs that are playing in a bit more of a noisier emo mold, unless the main guitar melody is slightly higher and cleaner in the mix, the thicker riffs just bulldoze everything in their path and don't quite deliver enough to really show for it in terms of a melodic hook, at least for me. Of course, the larger story with the Wonder Years has always been the songwriting and lyrics. And what's really important to note here is that it's less that Campbell's writing style has changed and more that his focus and scope has. His choice of words and the imagery, he's always had a knack for fine observational detail and a comfort with a certain degree of abstraction. But Sister Cities cast its eyes to a much broader horizon than drama that's more personal or close to home, which, yes, by extension can make these stories a little bit tougher to engage with, especially when you factor in the dramatic stakes of these stories are not really his alone like you would see in a lot of emo. More often than not, he is an observer, he's got some distance, or at least has a degree of separation from those who are actively suffering or passing on. Sometimes from addiction, like on Pyramids of Salt or Heaven's Gate, Sad and Sober, sometimes from the ravages of cancer on Ghost of Right Now, or even just the long, slow passage of time on It Must Get Lonely. And just that step to have the maturity to empathize shows the Wonder Years expanding their scope necessarily, but the key juxtaposition comes with the other underlying themes, namely that for as scattered as his path has been all around this world, he's experienced a lot of genuine kindness, sometimes through cultural exchange and traditions that he doesn't pretend to understand, like in the Japanese shrine on Raining in Kyoto, or the help that's given to him while stranded in Chile on the title track, but also defying a lot of the cynicism you would think would come to the forefront in the face of seeing so much suffering that he can't directly change or impact. And when you consider the deeply held insecurities that he also can't quite believe that he's deserving any of that kindness, it leads to a powerful interwoven thematic core in highlighting the value of that generosity and that compassion even when it doesn't result in any tangible change against the larger world, if only just a balm of security and support. And that's what gives songs like When the Blue Finally Came and The Ocean Grew Hands to Hold Me such real tangible power for me, because when facing that bone-deep tiredness and depression with your walls firmly entrenched, it can be so damn hard to open yourself up to that larger world that is often far better than we give him credit, especially when it gives you just that ray of hope. Or to quote the band directly, it's a record about distance, or maybe how little that distance might seem to matter anymore, and I respect the band a lot for that. So okay, to wrap it all up, you know, I understand why a lot of the Wonder Years fans are cooler on this album, because it is definitely a step away from a sound and a style they damn near perfected. And on top of that, I really can't say it's one of their best. I think I'll still like Suburbia more, as there is definitely thematic detours that don't quite pay themselves off, with We Look Like Lightning being the most pronounced example. And there is definitely a part of me that would love to see the band continue to innovate within the space of the genres of emo and pop punk, rather than feel like they have to shift genres to expand their scope. But at the same time, for as transitional as this album is, I think already it has been underrated. The thematic core is very rich, the hooks are still strong against tones that would naturally push them down, the lyrical detail is excellent, and I can't help but feel like a record like this opens a lot of doors for the Wonder Years creatively, if only just in terms of the subject matter. And if they can keep it as emotionally resonant as this is, that's tremendously powerful. There's a ton of potential going forward. And as such, for me, I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. And while I don't quite know if this will grow on me as much as All These Countless Nights did, I am really looking forward to finding out. For everybody else, especially the diehard fans, please, you're gonna want to give this one a lot of listens. Trust me when I say, it's worth it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm a little surprised I'm as positive on this record as I am, but yeah, it got to me. I like the broader scope that they took with it, and the writing is at that level that it's always been. I'm impressed that they brought it forward there. So if you guys want to actually debate that, the poll's up there. You want to buy the record, links in the description down there below. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in supporting this channel so these reviews will come out a little bit earlier, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. If you want to see the schedule, it's linked down there below. Keep in mind, I have changed the Patreon structure from a per video to a per month structure, so some of the tiers might be a little bit more accessible to everybody else here. I'd be happy if you guys hop on board. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'm see you next time.